we're doing one of those things where we break ranks, I say that, but gratifyingly, Newsnight is finally in the place where it should be. So we're breaking ranks with much of the UK media, but not all of it, thanks to the superb team of journalists at BBC Newsnight. Anybody who still watches that programme will be aware of what is on the horizon. Many people won't. In short, I presume from midnight on Wednesday, I presume it kicks in at 1 minute after midnight on February the 1st, we will be having non-tariff barriers on all food and drink or all animal-based imports coming into this country, which rather gives the lie to this comment from just 4 years ago, almost to the day. I wonder whether you recognise the voice.
At this point, it's worth going back to what the former PM Boris Johnson said on the 24th of December 2020, after he signed that last-minute free trade deal with the EU.
There will be no palisade of tariffs on January the 1st, and there'll be no non-tariff barriers to trade.
So he was right that there would be no tariffs, taxes on imports, but wrong about the non-tariff barriers. That's precisely what these new import checks are.
And no one ever really thought that there would be tariffs, except, of course, the people who were telling you that WTO rules would be absolutely fine. I wonder if you can remember anybody doing that. Again, it is somebody with a rather recognisable voice. Here you go. This might jog your memory.
I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with it. It would have increased costs for people.
So, Jacob Rees-Mogg not understanding that it is inevitable under World Trade Organization rules. The basic facts are that you cannot have one regime in place unless you're in a customs union, brackets or a single market. I still get a little bit confused about that, but nobody's perfect. Unless you're in a customs union, you can't have one rule for one customer and another rule for another one. That is a basic premise, a basic requirement of the World Trade Organization. So this was inevitable. This was always going to happen. It had to happen. The temptation is, and this is where I think J-Dog lost the plot. The temptation is to think, well, let's not introduce any checks whatsoever. We'll just trust the European Union not to send any dodgy stuff over. So we'll have checks on stuff coming in from China, but we won't have any checks coming in on stuff coming in from France. And yet, of course, he has no choice in that matter. Now, with Rees-Mogg, and the reason I say it's a slightly odd show is that I presented Newsnight not long after Brexit went through. It was a fascinating period of my career where I felt increasingly lonely because I understood this stuff. That's not arrogance or conceit, or it's not even an opinion, it's just counting. I understood this stuff. And there were days when I was smashing my head against a brick wall, metaphorically speaking, wondering why we had to have guests who didn't. Wondering why, for example, if you had a guest who said that the world wasn't going to end on Tuesday, you also had to have a guest who would argue very passionately the world was going to end on Tuesday. And now, in the context of Brexit, Tuesday has arrived and the world has not ended. So all of those people who were arguing from a position of complete ignorance have been proved completely wrong. From the man who signed the deal, from the man who boasted about getting Brexit done, the man who looked you in the eye and told you there would be no non-tariff barriers on goods coming into Britain. The precise opposite is now happening. So when Victoria Derbyshire opened Newsnight last night, something that I've been waiting for the best part of a decade happened, and it was, in the context still of what the rest of the British media is doing, it was quite extraordinary.
It was Conservative Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg who promised cheaper food after Brexit, and it was former Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson who said there would be no extra checks on trade. It appears both were wrong. The day after tomorrow, post-Brexit checks begin to be brought in on certain produce coming to the country from the EU. Checks that have been delayed 5 times. And they will push up the domestic price of imported food. Such extra checks and charges, a move away from years of frictionless, free-flowing trade, became inevitable because of the shape of the Brexit deal agreed with the EU in 2020.
Now, this is extraordinary for a country to be indulging. We are, as a consequence of political imbecility and a grossly misled public, we are now making life considerably harder or measurably harder for anybody seeking to bring into this country anything from pork to sugared liquid eggs that are used in cake and sauces. There is a shortage of vets to sign the health certificates on the continent that are needed to send stuff here that is currently sent with no friction whatsoever. There's no trusted trader scheme. There's no clarity about what rules and regulations will apply. A system that is based on stuff arriving on a slow boat from China is going to be expected, as of Thursday morning, to deal with stuff that has hopped over the English Channel in a matter of minutes. That's not my opinion. That's Karen Goodburn, who's the Director General of the Chilled Food Association, representing some of the UK's biggest chilled food manufacturers. Physical inspection begins from the end of April. That will see European companies facing the pain of border bureaucracy for the first time since the trade deal came into force in January 2021. I genuinely, and the reason I say this has a slightly personal flavour for me today, is that I knew this day was coming. And I don't expect any sympathy. I'm certainly not expecting you to take out the world's smallest violin. But I took quite a lot of abuse for simply pointing this stuff out, for simply, on the rare occasions that I could get near somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg, simply highlighting that he didn't know what he was talking about. And then people who, I don't know why you were so certain he would be right about this stuff and I would be wrong, but you were really horrible to me, which is fine. It goes with the territory, it's par for the course. But where did that come from? Where did that idea come from, that I was being motivated by something unhealthy or unpleasant, and he was the one that was dedicated to telling you the truth, when the facts were bloody obvious? The simple requirements of World Trade Organization observations mean that you can't give France an easier ride on getting grub into this country than China gets. And therefore these tests, these checks, these barriers would have to come in. And then Johnson, building an entire Brexit. There were days when I thought I was going mad. I would sit here and listen, let's not beat about the bush. There were plenty of people who also sit in this chair who were saying the polar opposite of what reality made clear. It was a really weird period of my career, because I'd sit here and think, well, he's not stupid. She's not stupid. And they certainly don't lie to you deliberately, but they don't seem to understand any of this. They don't seem to have the barest grasp of what is actually going to happen. They're just taking the words of a proven liar like Boris Johnson, who would subsequently, of course, quit Parliament as a consequence of his lies, and a proven idiot like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who would end up as business secretary because they had to keep promoting the people who didn't understand anything. The alternative was reality. And you would hear people and read people who seem to have taken leave of their senses. And that's why there are days when you think it might be you that's gone a bit mad. You think maybe it's me that doesn't understand anything. I used to read you that quote from George Orwell all the time. Do you remember? There was truth and there was untruth. And if you clung to the truth, even against the whole world, you were not mad. Rees-Mogg would tell us that food will be cheaper. He categorically told us that food will be cheaper, and now it's going to be more expensive. Now, there are two things I want to do today. One, I don't know, you're probably too busy. You're probably too busy to give me a ring because you're trying to get ready for the changes that are coming in. But if you're not, if you can spare me a moment, if you work in agriculture, in food import, food export, if there are elements of what is unfolding this year that I'm not aware of or that I've missed, then you know what to do. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. There are a few corners of the British media still dedicated to telling you the truth, chiefly Newsnight, as I've mentioned, and the Financial Times. The Guardian picks up on the new border rules cutting the shelf life of fresh fruit from the continent by a fifth, leaving some deliveries unsaleable, because if you cut the shelf life by a fifth, you're not going to be able to sell it anymore. This is the SPS Certification Working Group, representing 30 bodies covering £100 billion worth of the UK's food supply. They say that requirements for importers to notify authorities a day before goods arrived in the UK were unfeasible and could mean some EU businesses stopping supply entirely. I don't know how many listeners I've got who are in the business of exporting food from the European Union into the United Kingdom. But if I'm lucky enough to have anybody in that category tuned in today, are you fully across what you're going to have to do? Are you fully clear about what is going to happen? This kicks in from April, this particular element of the new rules. And it strikes me that most people are utterly unaware. Yes, fish as well. We're supposed to have cheaper fish. It was supposed to be a good deal for fishermen. It strikes me that most people are completely unaware of what is set to happen. And that's where the second question comes in. And this is, I don't think this is childish. I think this is actually quite important. It's linked to history. And it is history. Historians will wrestle with this question. I'll play you those clips again of Johnson and Rees-Mogg, who have now been proved categorically wrong, not only about their understanding of what Brexit would involve, but about the detail and the ramifications of the deal that Boris Johnson won an entire election by lying about. Okay? So let's have Johnson first.
At this point, it's worth going back to what the former PM Boris Johnson said on the 24th of December 2020, after he signed that last-minute free trade deal with the EU.
There will be no palisade of tariffs on January the 1st, and there'll be no non-tariff barriers to trade.
So he was right that there would be no tariffs, taxes on imports, but wrong about the non-tariff barriers. That's precisely what these new import checks are.
Ben Chu on Newsnight there, I think, being very generous to Boris Johnson when he said that he was wrong about this. I think he was lying. Well, that's the question really, isn't it? Are these men deeply, deeply dishonest, or were they just profoundly ignorant of things about which they claimed to be experts? Here's Rees-Mogg.
I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with it. It would have increased costs for people.
Actually, yeah, a cabinet-level minister still not understanding the consequences of his own actions. It's extraordinary. So let's get the phone lines open. 60 minutes after 10 is the time. 0345 60 60973 is the number you need. Do you know what this is going to mean for you and for your business, for your livelihood? And the second question, which I would genuinely like you to join in on, because if you've been listening to this programme for some of the last few years, you're among the best qualified people in the country to answer this question. Rees-Mogg and Johnson, probably the biggest standard bearers for the disastrous Brexit that we ended up with. You're perfectly entitled to still believe there was an alternative that was better. A brilliant Brexit, just goes to a different school. But you take Rees-Mogg and Johnson, Rees-Mogg's entire reputation built upon that sort of jingoistic sabre rattling, which is an odd phenomenon, given that he doesn't look like he could lift up a sabre, never mind rattle one. And then Johnson promising this, promising that, promising the other, claiming he'd done it, claiming he'd delivered it, claiming it was oven ready, claiming it was brilliant. Now proven by events to be wrong. So I think there's different answers for each man, but you can go into as much detail as you want. You can do them separately, together. You can do them distinguish one from the other. But let's focus on those two in particular. There's plenty of others we could bring into it, like Ian Duncan Donuts and David Davis and all the rest of them, and Nadine Dorries, of course, who had to ask colleagues what the customs union was because she kept losing arguments about why it was a good idea to leave it. But let's focus on those two. Rees-Mogg and Johnson, do you think they were lying to the British public, or do you think they genuinely didn't understand what they were selling? Lying or ignorant? 0345 60 60973. Okay? I think it's a really important question. I think ignorance is probably more forgivable than deceit. I think you're probably allowed both, but I will want you to explain your working. Question number one, how is this going to affect you? 0345 60 60973. Question number two, the men who swore blind that this was not going to happen, the men who promised you that this was not going to happen, now that we know it's happening, do you think that they lied to you? Or that, for example, when Jacob Rees-Mogg appeared on this programme, he genuinely didn't understand what he was talking about? So are they ignorant or dishonest? Or a combination perhaps of both?